Welcome to the Property Legends. Today we have with us Frank Berkeley, well known in the South African property market. Those who have certainly financed properties over the last decade will know Frank, met him, and certainly in his time at Nedbank. The interview today will be undertaken with Rob McGaffin and myself. And we're not doing any introductions as we start. So we are immediately going to start asking Frank, how did you get into the property market? Let's just go back a few years. It's often said that many of us in the property market drop into the sector by chance or others. And certainly compared to some of those entering now who have degrees in property, maybe many of us didn't have that luxury. Frank,
yeah, I think Francois in the dark ages, they didn't have degrees in property that I can recall. And I think I fell in by default. I'm a chartered accountant by profession, and I was doing an audit of a construction company, a home developer, really, a company called Goff Cooper. Mm-hmm. And they needed a new financial manager, and I thought, well, this is probably better than auditing, which anything's better than auditing. So I offered me a job, and I went there, and you got stuck in property. So that's what happened. So I started as financial manager, became financial director, became CEO, and that was all residential development. Right. And then left the industry for about 2 or 3 years, and then got offered a job with Cyfritz. They approached me and they said, would you like to come and run our commercial property business in Johannesburg? And I knew nothing about commercial property, quite honestly, but went along and thought, well, now I can become a banker. It's quite cool. And I thought I'd be there for about 5 or 6 years, because that's I'd spent 6 years in this job and a few in those. And the 6 years became 20. And as soon as it was boring, something happened. There was a merger or a crisis or something, and that kept you there because that was interesting. Mm. So that's the last 20 salaried years of my working career were at Nedbank, which I enjoyed thoroughly, I must say. I enjoyed.
Frank, you mentioned Cyfritz. I remember from certainly in the 90s, Cyfritz, URERU, and there were a few players who had started playing a bit in this financing of the commercial. Because I suppose for those of you in the sector now, I mean, if we go back 2 decades, commercial property wasn't a big thing in the banking.
No, you're correct. 25 years ago, banks didn't lend on commercial property. Right. The only funding you could really get was what they call participation bonds, which were syndicated loans effectively done by Cyfritz and a few other people. Right. And then it sort of developed from there. And then the banks used to do home loans, and they stuck their toe into the commercial field. And that developed because it's much easier. It's far more flexible because part bonds, you had a fixed period. Right. Very inflexible, and you had participants. If someone had to leave, you had to find another one in it, because each one was sort of ring-fenced. So the banks got in it, and then it really took off. I mean,
So how were commercial properties financed then?
With these participation bonds. That when you needed money as a borrower, you'd go to Cyfritz, for example, and they would go and find the investors, and they'd put them into your bond. Right. So it was really a syndicated mortgage loan.
Yeah.
But they were very inflexible. So.
And in fact, if I'm correct, the big players 20 or more years ago were the big institutions, your Old Mutuals, your Liberty, your Sage. They were the big players.
They were very big developers. I mean, Old Mutual, for many years, Old Mutual was like the property university. Right. And you had guys like Ian Watt, who was a legend too. And Ian, he built some of the biggest shopping centres. Yeah, the great shopping centres. Some of them probably a little bit before the time, but he found good sites and built fantastic stuff. And over time, they I think when some real characters left some of those institutions, I think they lost the flavour a bit. And I think they didn't have that passion for property anymore. Maybe they had better alternatives or more exciting alternatives. But so then you had the other people. Then, of course, REITs came in. Yeah. You had people having their own portfolios, building them up, and then the real estate investment trusts came. Before that, you had sort of what we call loan stock companies, trusts. And those all sort of died. REITs were a far better solution.
But it's actually with the REITs that the banks really started playing a more important role in this, or was it before? So it was already.
Yeah, it was before, because you had some really big developers,
Right.
guys that built up big portfolios. You think of Atfund with Louis Norval and Zenprop with Rodney Weinstein, Atterbury with Louis van der Walt, guys like that.
Yes.
And they built up big portfolios of big developers, really, world-class people.
Yeah.
And then the REITs came a little, those PUTs, property unit trusts, sort of transformed. And then that took off because the banks found, it was much easier for the banks because they could lend into these things at much lower loan to values, much lower risk. So it was kind of no-brain lending in many cases. I think it's a bit more tricky now, but with what's happened. But certainly, previously, when banks were lending to individuals, they'd lend on commercial properties sort of 75 to 80% loan to value. And with REITs, it's probably 40, 45. So the level, and it's a greater spread usually. So it's a lower level of risk. But it's boring stuff, though. It's not fun for a banker. You don't see anything coming out of the ground.
But even with the funding of properties, have we seen other players apart from the REITs? I mean, if you in the banking world, we often look at the REITs, but there are a lot of private players, smaller players. I mean, have those become important over the last few years? Has there been a growth there, or is this sort of dominated by the 30-odd REITs that we have in South Africa?
There's still, I would imagine that most property is not owned by the REITs. The bigger buildings, the big shopping centres, most of them are owned by the REITs.
Yeah.
But the high props, the growth points. But if you look at the vast majority of offices, and there's still some massive private portfolios as well, that guys have built up, and they don't want to be in the goldfish bowl. So some have gone listed for various reasons. Or they can get a lower cost of funding usually, and the capital gains tax benefits. But there's still a lot of big portfolios and some very private people who just like to keep the title deeds in their safe and manage their portfolios exceptionally well. I mean, really good stuff.
So do you think that there are portfolios out there that could come to the market over the next years? You think they're big enough private portfolios still?
Oh, they are. Yes, they are, definitely.
Really?
Whether they'll come to the market or not. I mean, often generational things happen.
Sure.
That somebody starts it and the children might not be interested in that industry. And then they could sell the whole portfolio.
And listing is not everything always, and some people have regretted.
No, listing isn't everything. I'm involved. I'm the chairman of a listed company called Exemplar Retail, which was a family-owned portfolio in Pretoria, the McCormick family, and they still run the thing really. And that's a very big portfolio that they listed about nearly 2 years ago. Really rural retail, which has been almost recession-proof through COVID. It's done exceptionally well.
Following up on a little bit of that, I mean, you mentioned some of the changes that you've seen in the industry over the years, etc. But I mean, what would be some of the sort of iconic changes that you think you've seen over the decades, from sort of the 80s, 90s, 2000s, etc.? Have there been sort of structural changes that you've seen?
I think there have. There've been, one of the things that's interesting is how towns have moved, or CBDs rather. You remember the old when I was young, you guys are a bit younger, but Johannesburg was the CBD of Africa.
Yeah.
Johannesburg itself, the city centre. And that over time started to move. It sort of moved a bit out to Rosebank, and then it got a hold in Sandton, and then it just moved to Sandton. And you had a couple of banks left in Johannesburg. And the reasons for that, I mean, I think the main reason, and it was quite devastating because you had these big buildings that became kind of quite derelict, and it really became a seedy place. And I mean, it's sort of been resuscitated to some degree, largely trying to put residential, often government offices. Yeah. But the main reason was, I think, town planning, because the town planning in Johannesburg in those days, they said, we do not want parking. We want everyone to use buses and public transport. So they made the parking restrictions very difficult. And people like to drive to work because the public transport has never been great. Yeah. And Sandton didn't have that restriction, so they started building offices in Sandton.
So the big decentralization trend was obviously
and
a big one.
And then things like office parks came in from high-rise sort of office buildings, big shopping centres. I remember when they built Sandton City, it was kind of really, it was a tiny bit of what it is today. And it just grew and grew and grew and grew. So you didn't really have big regional shopping centres. You had strip shops. I mean, Randburg was a very big shopping area where you had all the little shops. And when the malls came, it kind of killed that totally.
Are there certain things that haven't worked? I mean, I remember a few years ago, there was these discount centers. There's certain concepts that we tried to bring from the US.
Those sort of value mart kind of things.
Yes.
I think they had a place, and they've been, I think, reasonably successful. And the rentals generally lower because the cost of building was lower. So it took a different kind of tenant. And some of them, I think, have worked quite well.
Okay.
But the malls, and I think particularly in South Africa, we build some of the best malls in the world. I mean, we really have exceptional malls. You can travel the world and these are great. They have a different flavor. If you go to America, you hardly ever find a food store. You won't find a Checkers or a Pick and Pay in a mall. It's almost unheard of. They're separate buildings. You very seldom find banks in malls. I mean, you'll find the ATMs, but you don't find the banks.
And of course, we charge for parking.
and we charge for parking. But I mean, what we found here is that, and I think it's a function of security, it's almost an entertainment kind of thing that we're talking about, Ian brought in, that people feel secure in a shopping mall. So they go there and they do everything they can do. And it's almost, because people don't necessarily like walking around the streets much here. So they do that and they come to malls, and it became a center almost of the community. Right. And that's continued. And what we found are the retailers like Pick and Pay and Checkers, and to a degree Spar, they were the anchors. They pulled people in. But you don't find that in the States.
What's your view on the townships? I mean, for the last 10 years, we said, well, the townships have got opportunities. We've got the Maponya malls. We've got some of the malls. But we never seem to have got beyond the mall. When we look at offices, when we... I'm not saying that many of them still have this feeling of dormitory towns, which I don't know if it's a risk or whether it's where the market... Some people would have argued these are great opportunities for call centers, for example.
Yeah, I think I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
The malls certainly have done well. They trade exceptionally well. I think part of it was probably the town planning and the zoning, that they probably, when these were really residential and they're trying to carve pieces out for a mall, but pieces weren't carved out for offices necessarily.
Yeah, exactly.
So it wasn't town planned. And it's also very, they're highly populated. So it's very difficult to now sort of take away a whole lot of residential and put offices there because it has social consequences.
Frank, over your career, what are some of the bigger developments that you've been involved with?
There have been quite a few. I think of generally the shopping centres are some of the bigger ones.
Yeah.
I remember Cape Gate, which we did with Jaco Windal. Well, he did it and we funded it and took a little piece. That was a big one. Bay West in Port Elizabeth was a massive, beautiful centre. Port Elizabeth is it's probably a bit ahead of its time, but it's a stunning centre. Mall of Africa was probably the biggest. I mean, that was a massive centre that we all know about in Midrand. And then a lot of great office buildings in Sandton. And those were, they're particular developers there in Sandton. There are guys like Zenprop who've built a huge amount in Sandton very successfully and built exceptional buildings. I mean, those buildings are absolutely world-class. I remember going it's a few years now. It's probably, I doubt it's actually dated, but going into Alexander Forbes as they finished it. On the outside, it's not that fantastic, but inside, it's a remarkable building. As someone who loves property, you can actually spend a day in this place just wandering around and seeing how much thought has gone into it and the quality. And now
the late Mark Wayner said that properties have got personalities.
They do.
And they do. You walk in a building, it's got a personality, and another one doesn't.
No, they do.
Or different, at least.
Yeah. You look at the Discovery building in Sandton now. I mean, it's spectacular. And the 144 Oxford where Anglo-American have moved in. I mean, magnificent buildings. Right. They are iconic. I think we've built some outstanding offices in this country. The guys have kind of stretched the envelope a bit, but instead of just building blocks, they've really done Sandton's full of amazing architecture. It's like a mini Chicago. It really is, because it's, Chicago, if you've been there, is mind-boggling when it comes to architecture.
Yeah. Being involved in all of these large developments and sort of iconic developments, what are the lessons you learned by being involved in those projects, both from a property point of view, so understanding what developers got right, what they got wrong, etc., but then also from a funding point of view, what were the lessons learned with respect to those projects?
I think from a property point of view, there's been an evolution over time. And things change, and what the advancements have really come from the developers and the architects. And I think the banks sometimes held things back a bit because, you know, you're a little bit behind the curve a bit. Sometimes to the benefit of the client, because we saw some things, ideas that guys came up with which just would never have flown. I mean, and some that we stretched a bit and worked well. And so, but it's bricks and mortar. I think what's happened in the last couple of years are the green buildings. I think it's very important.
Okay.
Because buildings, when you start pouring concrete and laying bricks, they are very bad for the environment. I mean, cement is a very bad thing, but, you know, we need it. You can't build high-rise out of wood. And steel also uses a huge amount of power to create it. So, but once they're built, they're built. So if you build them well and design them properly, I think that green building movement and that green building council, it was really started by Bruce Kurzweil here a couple of years back, I think has done fantastic things. So now you've got 5-star, 6-star. I think that's been a big change. I think also if you look, to me, what's always important is what sort of made it successful. What makes a successful developer?
Successful developer or development?
Well, I think if the development fails, so does the developer.
Fair enough.
It kind of follows. But I think, and what makes people successful in property? Because they may not always have the great developments, but they're just successful in property. They might be great deal makers. Yes. And I think it's, to me, this is something that's been far more interesting to me very often than the technical side, because we like to look at the things and say this is sort of air conditioning, the style, the design, how you use the sun. But what's made people who are really successful, the technical skills are a given. You kind of have to have those. Otherwise,
you have a professional team.
You can't play in that game otherwise. But the really successful guys, there's one thing that actually distinguishes all of them. When I say all of them, probably 90%, is that they have the ability to get on with people. And that actually is something that, you know, it's very hard to teach, but you can help people with. People who have emotional intelligence, who have empathy, they can do deals that other people can't do. They can get people to work with them. And I think that's the distinguishing factor from people who do well to people who do great stuff, is that ability to work with people, because you can't do everything yourself. Yeah. And you've got to get them motivated, you've got to get them fired up and involved and get that creative thinking going.
And a bit of tenacity.
You need tenacity because it's very difficult. It's difficult in as much that municipal regulations and the slowness of decision making, it's got worse and worse almost throughout the country. So that's become slow. We don't have the same, if you're building a building today, we don't have the level of contractors we used to have. I mean, they've disappeared. They've gone. Some have gone bankrupt, the others have scaled down. So it's far more restricted, the pool, which is very sad. So I think the economy is in dire straits. We all know that. I mean, and it doesn't look as though it's going to get better anytime soon, if ever. So it's a lot more difficult. But whatever happens is the distinguishing factor really for the great guys is the people who can get on with others.
Frank, just to take that a step further, it's always interested me where people like yourself, if I were to give you a feasibility study on something, there's certain things that you will look at very quickly, which will almost say, no, thank you. It's that, you know, and the point, and one of the reasons we have these series as well, is that I believe that over years you build up an intuition. You know, what I always say, when our students leave varsity, they have the toolbox, they have the DCFs and so forth. People who've been for 20, 30 years in a sector can look at something and say, this is not going to work. This is not, I can see it coming. Do you have that sense of things that you look for immediately when you look at a development? Or is it more complicated?
No, I think it's both complicated and simple.
Okay.
I think intuition is something that's always fascinated me, and it's, you know, you can kind of say it's some sort of sixth sense, you feel it in your gut.
But it's a lot more than that, and the studies that it's experience.
It's really experience, and I think it probably is how do you apply your experience? Does your brain work in a way that you can apply that experience that you may have had on a different kind of thing to this project or this whatever you're looking at now? because, and I think that's kind of what, I do think there is a degree of some sort of sixth sense that really some people, and I've seen it before where you can have some guys who are 55 years old, they've done the same thing, and they don't have it. And you can have a 25-year-old who's never actually, might have done this once, never even seen it, but they have a sense for something. And then you know that person's in the right industry, because they just got a feel for it. And it's not something that you can necessarily teach. But I think there's a whole world out there that fascinates me of how you can apply sort of thinking processes and systems thinking that can probably improve a heck of a lot of what we do.
As the Nobel Prize Kahneman wrote that book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, makes the point that you've got to keep that balance between intuition, but you also need the person knowledge. Who's going to check the numbers.
You need the QS. You don't have the QS, you know, this looks wonderful, and the cash flows are critical. Cash flows are everything. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, is that just to come back? I mean, and maybe that's what you're hinting at, because I asked you sort of the lessons learned, and you spoke about the properties and the developers themselves from a funding point of view and from providing finance. What were the lessons that you learned over that period of time, being involved in these big projects, etc., etc.? And there must have been some sort of lessons learned there.
And some things must have gone wrong.
I won't admit to any of that. No, look, I think, again, probably follow your gut. Because, you know, every single time I look back, and there were some that went wrong, clearly. I mean, you lend money for 20 years, you lose a bit here and there. But I did an analysis one day. I thought, what's actually sort of the bigger ones that have been problematic? Not obviously bad, but they were tricky.
Right.
And they were where you actually kind of eventually sold it to yourself. Initially, you looked at it, you thought, but then you kind of justified why this will work. And those ones,
your biases start.
Exactly. Inevitably, those became problematic. If you looked at the thing from day one and it worked, and you did all the bits, you kick it from every side. Generally, it worked. The other, to me, the key as a banker at that stage was to look and to say, who are you dealing with? That developer is absolutely key. And you've got to, you know, you got to see what they could do and what were their skills. I mean, some guys are unbelievable at shopping centres, and they're hopeless at offices because they've never really done enough of that. And if because the guys have done it, they know what the problems are, and also, you know, you're dealing with a chap or a lady that you've got to know over the years, and absolutely critical is for you to have faith in your client, to actually trust him. You've got to trust him. If you have any doubts about their integrity, you pack your bags and you run a mile as quickly as you can. Because, you know, that's what's going to make it work in the end. And not only from your point of view as a banker, but that person's going to deal with his architect, with his subcontractors, with the contractors. And if they deal badly with them, everything starts to go badly. So honesty and integrity are absolutely key. I mean, I had clients that, quite frankly, if the bank had the rules that allowed me, I would have lent them R1 billion on a handshake. There are people out there that you can do that whatever happens, they would pay you back. And, I mean, generally it was successful. But if something went wrong, you knew that they would never walk away from it. And I think that the other lesson is for people who are borrowing from banks, because there are a lot more of them than there are banks. And I used to lecture occasionally at the business school in Cape Town. And what I think as a borrower from the bank, an absolutely vital thing, is keep talking to your bank. Don't ever hide anything away, because if things start to go bad, you must tell your banker, I've got a problem coming. Don't give them surprises. Bankers hate surprises more than anything, because the surprises are never good. They're only bad. And if there's a problem looming, go and talk to them. Tell them, firstly, what the banker then says, this person is looking ahead. They can see what's coming. They're making a plan. They're coming to talk to us. And inevitably, the banker will say, I have faith in this person. They've got an issue. A big tenant's gone belly up, or they can see it trading badly or whatever, because they can see the turnovers before you.
In fact, let's maybe move a bit into the future. I think we've seen investors a few years ago going off to Africa, the border beyond South African borders. Some did well, some didn't. I think I just saw this morning somebody is selling their shopping center in Nigeria now. What was your view, before we move to prop tech and a few other things, what was your view on this whole movement of investors into the African continent. Because, to be honest, it hasn't worked out as a great success, or if I've followed it correctly. The risks were probably higher than many imagined. I believe some banks took a view at the time which said, well, as long as you go with your professionals that you normally use, it mitigates maybe some of the risks.
I think it was far more challenging than anybody thought. I mean, I got quite a lot of things wrong, but one I got right was I was extremely skeptical about going and putting a lot of money into Africa, north of the borders here. And the reasons are really simple, actually. You've got a lot of political instability. Mm. You've got probably one of the biggest problems is you've got a massive level of corruption. You had markets that generally are poor. Right. I mean, and they look and say, well, you know, Nigeria was a rich place. Well, when oil prices are booming, it probably was, but it's Africa generally is quite poor.
No, it's commodity driven.
Yeah. Exactly. So you've got that issue. And then, which is always a very big concern for me, you've got a very uncertain legal system. Mm. And if you don't have a legal system where you know that you own this property, and if something goes wrong, or you can execute against it as a mortgage holder, you can go to the court, you can get an execution order, you can take the property back. If you can't do that because there are all sorts of underhand things going on or things that you don't understand, you're putting billions into the ground, and you can't then go and load up your building and move it. You know, you can go and take your truck and drive it out, but it's hard to move your office block.
And those legal systems are also very different, whether you're on the east or the west, etc. So you've got to get up to speed with those different systems as well. So
and you're going there, and you're putting your money in there, and you must never and someone's selling you the piece of property, and never forget the seller always knows more than the buyer. Believe it. And in property too, I mean, I've said it for years, is that you make the money the day you buy it or the day you build it, not the day you sell it. Because if your price isn't right at the beginning, it's never going to get to you. You're never going to get anywhere. Yeah. So I think Africa has been pretty much a disaster for developers. I don't know any of them have actually made money. Oh, right. Everyone's tried to get out and they've gone.
And then you've got exchange rates, and then you've got dollar leases, which are no longer dollar leases, as we saw.
And then you can't get your money out because there's no forex. And then you're trying to get your materials in to build, and there's some guy sitting in customs there who wants you to look after him financially, or he doesn't let the stuff come through. And your building sits for 3 months doing nothing. So.
Okay. Let's leave Africa, but over the last few years, quite a number of our REITs have taken a view of going overseas to some countries that few of us had heard of. But nevertheless, in Central Europe, I think we saw the opportunity. There's been criticism. I mean, some investors say, if I want to invest overseas, I'll go and invest in a fund overseas. I don't need a South African fund to do that for me. Any views on the international diversification of our investors?
I think it was done out of desperation. And I think largely it's been quite successful. South African developers and property guys are really as good as anybody. I mean, we don't have the scale of the US or the Europe, but I mean, the good guys can hold up with anybody. They really are good. So, and I think they also were probably more brave coming from Africa, where things are more uncertain, than a lot of the Western Europeans.
Who wouldn't go to those countries?
They, going to Romania. People didn't want to go to Romania, but South Africans, Romania is kind of...
the risk profile.
We understand the place. And so those Eastern European countries, we weren't as scared as perhaps the Germans were, or the French or the British, because that was kind of very third worldish to them. And I think the guys have done well because they found a new market. The future is a little uncertain, but I don't think it's been a bad thing. I think these companies have done pretty well out of their foreign. And of course, you moved rands 10 years ago, when the rand was double what it's worth now. So whatever's happened, if you've had no growth in the local currency in rands, you've doubled.
And your view on the raising of debt overseas?
It's actually in many ways easier. They don't like lending as much as South African banks do, loan to value generally, but it's non-recourse lending. So, you can ring fence it. They don't ask for suretyships generally. So they look at that building, and that's what they lend you on the building. So you've got to put a bit more equity into it. But that's how it works.
Okay.
And if it goes bad, well, that's that building. It doesn't permeate
into the portfolio.
And are their financial structures the same? So do they have big commercial property divisions in their banks there, etc., like we've structured in South Africa? So they work on a similar basis?
They do. I spent about it's hard to make a judgment on 2 weeks, but I spent about 2 weeks in a German bank a few years ago, which remain nameless. It's one of the big German banks. But it was fascinating. I spent more days than I was supposed to stay there because they kind of, once I was into it, we got chatting and they were very open. They opened a branch in Colombia, for example. They were in Mexico, all over South America. And you say, how do you actually get enough skill in all these areas? Because property is local. It really is local.
Yeah.
There was I think the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the Congress in the US many years ago, a guy called Tip O'Neill. And he said, all politics is local. It's about what the local people want. And property is much the same. Your shopping centre.
Know your hood.
Know your hood. That's the best way to put it.
Yeah.
And how can you possibly be sitting in Frankfurt and get to understand what's going on in Peru without actually spending a long time there? And I think that's why, South Africans generally, the guys have been successful. I think they've bought into things they understood at good prices in Eastern Europe, which is because they saw the value. And I think it's turned out quite well. I don't know how it's going to be in the future, but it hasn't been bad.
And they're happy to get involved in development finance, because I know often kind of locally a lot of banks are that's the one part of the game that everyone's a bit nervous about.
They're all different. There's so many banks there.
Okay.
And the banks are massive. I mean, we actually have no concept how big they are. I mean, even South African banks are really quite small. You have in Australia, you have Westpac. I mean, I think it's bigger than the South African banking system. And that's Australia, which only has 20, 25, 30 million people. But our banks are really, they're, I think, exceptionally good.
Right.
South African banks, I can honestly tell you, are world class in the systems, in the way they do things. We've just got a relatively small market.
Okay.
But the guys are as good as anyone, really good.
Frank, we've got a few more minutes, but I'd like you to, if possible, where do you see the future of the South African property market? I mean, we've been in a cyclical downturn since December 2013. Some investors are starting to question whether the REIT structure is as good as we thought, whether it leaves enough to run the company, especially in bad times, with the distributions being as high as they are. There's a lot of talk about PropTech, environmental, ESG. Some foreign investors won't touch markets where there isn't a focus on environmental issues, green leases. There's even a view possibly at the moment which says the commercial property market for the next few years, there's not much there. It's going to be about the residential property market. It's going to be about the service, about the WeWorks, co-working, co-living.
There are a lot of questions there, Francis.
No, I know. But I suppose just to pick, how do you see the property sector, the world in front of you?
In South Africa?
In South Africa.
I think it's going to be very challenging.
Okay.
We were chatting a bit earlier, and as I said a few years ago, that I thought valuations on South African properties are very high. And because they were kind of predicated on the escalations built into leases.
Right.
And for years, I could not understand the logic of why one would go and buy a shopping centre at a 7% yield when you were borrowing money at 10%. And it's insane on the face of it. And if you did try to do that in Europe, people would have you locked up. But we did it because we said, well, there's a 10% or 7% lease escalation. So in a few years, it's caught up and that just carries on. But what the fundamental problem was that the assumption was that lease escalation is in perpetuity, goes on forever. And it doesn't. And now we're seeing that because now we have a recession ongoing and you see leases are not going up. Only the contractual ones are, but as soon as the lease comes to an end, there's a rental reversion and leases are going backwards.
So you're saying this thing hung on the 8% escalation?
Yeah. We got
the whole game.
And we got hung on that because of inflation was up.
No.
So we had long-term, and as soon as inflation is property's best friend. There's no question about that because you borrow money. In inflationary times, you must borrow as much as you can because your debt is not inflated. Exactly. But your building's going upwards. So eventually, it pays. You sell a little piece of it, you pay off your debt. So I think it's going to be very difficult because we're now seeing values coming back. And the valuation industry, I think, has been very reluctant to to come back on values. They're now doing it for the first time ever. I saw it in December that the guys are being quite heavy-handed. Maybe not heavy-handed, but they're doing it. In the UK, they've been ruthless about it for years. They had no qualms in dropping values. So I think it's going to be tricky there. I think but the real problem is the lack of GDP. You know, if the economy is slow, if property follows it, and
Rob, you always make that point. If the economy doesn't grow, where's the demand for space?
Where's the fundamentals?
And we're now sitting with 2.5 million square meters of office floating in the market in South Africa.
And we've built some fantastic buildings, but what's left behind is not. I mean, you took it, Discovery. They moved into this one big building in Sandton, which is spectacular. I think a very good decision, because Discovery had grown so. They were in all these little buildings, and it's inefficient. So they're now in one big efficient building, but what's left behind are all these sort of B-grade buildings, maybe A-grade, B-grade. And with no growth in the economy, they're standing empty. So the vacancies have climbed. As a result, rentals have come down, valuations are coming down. So it's going to be tough.
So where do we go? Offices oversupplied, shopping centres, regionals are so-so, neighbourhoods may be doing fairly well. Everyone's been betting on the logistics sector.
I think logistics has probably is probably good because overseas they're very good because of Amazon. We don't have Amazon, but we've got a few pretty good businesses that are doing quite well out of that. I think if you look for value now, I think as of today, the value is in the price of REITs, listed REITs at the moment. They have been devastating, those prices.
They've been ticking up in the last few days.
2 days, and I think they are still low because they've plummeted. If you look at most of them, they've dropped 75%. Sort of the best has probably dropped 50% since the beginning of COVID, or in the last 2 years.
Listeners, you've heard it.
Yeah, but I must predicate this. I'm not I don't have my FI certificate. It's not advice.
We are not giving investment advice. We will not take responsibility for anything that you do.
But I think there's value there. If you just look at the NAVs, even if you knock them 25%.
Absolutely.
There's some. You look at some of those shares. Great portfolios of retail, good retail, and retail is always going to be good.
And you mentioned when we started small towns. I think I'm always amazed by small town South Africa and the opportunities. Some people say, well, it's just the transfer of the funds that the social grants that come everywhere. Hence, it is stable as long as you got social grants.
It's not. There's rural towns. It's not only social grants. I mean, there's a massive amount of migrant labour still.
Okay.
So you have people who are living in cities, and the rural base is there. The families are there. Often they like the family to be there because they don't have the same social pressures as they have in cities, and they send money home every year. I mean, you go to the ATMs in some of those rural places. I mean, on a Friday afternoon, a Saturday morning, the queues are hundreds of meters long, and the people are getting the money because it's being sent home and going doing the shopping.
Frank, I completely agree. Sorry, Rob?
No, you can also see it just by the size of the houses that have been built in some of these areas as well. I mean, these are not small houses that have been built in these rural areas. So there is a lot of money flowing from those urban areas back into the rural areas.
I completely agree. I mean, I do once a year sort of state of the nation trip. I get into my car and I go off for a drive, and I decided to drive from Cape Town to Durban, down the N2. Now, by the time you get to some of those towns in the Eastern Cape and in Kokstad and others, there's a lot happening there. Those are not idle towns where nothing is happening. Those streets are pretty busy.
The problem with a lot of those towns, in fact, most towns in South Africa, is the municipalities that have kind of crumbled. And that's, they're not properly managed. They don't have people who are skilled. There's been all the corruption. And, they're running out of water, they're running out of electricity, the sewage is over. I mean, that's disastrous. And that's really, it's almost inexcusable because it's not difficult to fix and to keep on maintaining.
And of course, Rob, I suppose the work that you're doing as well, I mean, it's the level of government at which the property sector operates most of the time.
Is local.
I mean, that's the platform. And if we if we can't get that platform right...
But do you think that's happening also in the urban areas as well, Frank? I mean, you're seeing it whether it's a Century City, Melrose Arch. I mean, they're quite highly managed, V&A waterfronts, etc., etc. Those are privately managed spaces. So, I mean, we're seeing increases.
They're still within cities, though. I mean, you've got your little precinct, but if the electricity or the sewage is not working, there's nothing you can do about it.
Sure.
So a lot of these rural actually have their own sewage plants now. They have their own borers, and they've had to do that, and they're getting more and more photovoltaic because of the breakdown.
Frank, 2 more points of discussion, and the first one is, what would you give as advice to someone joining the sector? Recent graduates entering the sector, and they often come to me and say, should I join a bank? Should I join a developer? Who should I join? And I often say, go to the bank, because you'll see a lot of feasibility studies and you'll learn a lot. But what sort of advice? I suppose you mentioned EQ. It's not just about getting your DCFs, right?
I think for someone who's a new graduate, say, I think it's very difficult right now because the industry is kind of on its knees. So if they can find a way in, even I reckon almost they should try and work for as little as possible just to try and get some experience. But not everyone can do that. They've got student loans, what they've got to do, they've got to pay them back. But in let's say slightly better times, if we can get there, I think they've got to look and see. A bank is always a good one, and banks pay quite well. And they don't retrench a lot of people, because good times, bad times, they need the people. But if they want to get into developments, I think it's difficult now. It's difficult worldwide. But COVID will go. We will get a vaccine. It'll be in 2 years' time. I think we'll be not quite where we were, but we'll be getting back. I think for your graduates, I think they must look broadly. I think many South Africans, I mean, I could speak for myself as a young person. I went overseas for the first time in my life when I was 30 years old. And I thought this travel's a waste of money and I must build something here. And then I went overseas and I went around Europe and to America. I came back with my eyes like this. I mean, this was 30-something years ago. But I think they should see themselves, and I think a lot of the young people do, they see themselves as international citizens. Don't just see your boundaries as here or where your world is. If you've got skills, travel, go and see what you can do, and look internationally. See, whatever you can do. You can find something there. You might want to come back. You might go there, but don't put yourself in a little box. That's sometimes quite difficult. But I'm fascinated. I think young people, I mean, I hear, as a 64-year-old, I hear so many of my friends say, the youth of today, the youth of today. I think the youth is amazing. I really do. I mean, you see a lot of youth because you're a lecturer. You see it all the time. But when I was still at Nedbank, we had some young people coming in on graduate programs, and they were astonishing. I found them very different to my style, because I realized quite quickly you can't manage them and say, I mean, generally, it's obviously people are all different, but to say to them, like in my day, you got this job, do this, I want it by tomorrow, and I'll come and check on you every now and then. This is a disaster for today.
Leave me alone.
Yeah, what I saw is give them the job and give them the deadline. And not once did they ever disappoint me. They produced the work by the deadline, high quality work. And I'd walk around and I'd walk past the canteen and I'd see them drinking coffee, 4 of them. 2 hours later, I go past, they're still drinking coffee. And I thought, well, just shut your mouth, leave them. Let's see if they're going to hang themselves. My style has always been give someone a lot of rope. They either will create a ladder or a noose. It's their choice. And, I mean, they never once disappointed me. So I just realized that the youth of today are fantastic. I think it's exceptionally difficult. I think they grow up with all social media. I think they are so tough by the time they get out of school and get out of university. I think they're both tough and vulnerable, but they are, if we were to take my generation of, say, 40 years ago when I was that age and compare me with these guys and these girls, they would destroy us.
Just wanted to go back a little bit. I mean, because we obviously through this series are going to be speaking to a lot of people who in the property space, but not all of them have been in finance. So just to focus a bit more on that finance, and I think over your period, I think a couple of things have happened. In particular, two. One, Basel. And over your period, you would have had to have dealt with Basel, probably 1, 2, and 3 all the way through, etc. And technology, but in banking or finance. and just your views on how those have influenced what you've done. So maybe start with Basel.
Are you talking about automated valuations and things?
Exactly, and financing, and it just, I mean, we're seeing now people can do applications on their phones and all kinds of things like that actually takes place, etc. And how that's influenced the banking sort of space.
Look, Basel made it far more difficult for banks. The intention was to improve the level of credit granting and make them stronger and safer by having these various levels of capital requirements. And I think I'm a bit skeptical about it because I'm not sure if it's made any difference. If you look then, the bad debt levels then and the bad debt levels in 2 years' time, if they're going to be any different, I don't think. They might even be worse. And I think it just added in another layer of costs and a layer of complexity. And I think that is not a good thing. Regarding the sort of technology on the credit granting, I think there's a lot to be said for that for consumer credit. Because it's relatively simple. You know, does a person have a job? Have they got a place to live? Have they got steady income? You can lend it. So that can speed it up dramatically. And I think that helps. But if you're talking about things like property where everyone is pretty different, it's not like a motor car. We all know that Mercedes 230e costs so much, and that's what you can sell it for in 2 years' time. The only difference is the color and the condition. So it's pretty much the same. Building's vastly different. You know, if you've got a bad office block, you can drop your rentals, you can still fill it. If you've got a badly designed shopping centre, best demolish it and start again, because you cannot fix a badly designed shopping centre. If it's a disaster, it's a disaster. So the intellect required to judge those buildings is different, and I think it's very hard to put a system in for that. I think it's just...
But I suppose it's changing. I mean, if you think about it, the banks themselves were big occupiers of space in their own right. And you're seeing now with COVID, from what I'm hearing, a lot of those employees are not going back into the office.
I think it's a lot more complicated. And why I think that is that it's very simple to say that people can work from home. And I think it's actually very nice that they can work from home and be far more flexible. So I think that sort of leapt us into the future to say that there's a great deal more flexibility and things still work because of the internet. I mean, and it does make a massive difference. And Zoom and these things have really changed the world quite quickly. But if you look at a company that's going to grow over time and the sustainability, to me, one of the most important determinants of its success is the culture of that company. And how do you now, and I'm sure there's a way, I don't know yet, but how do you create a culture in a company when the people never interact?
To your point, Francois.
And I think that's otherwise you just have an entity, but there's no sense of belonging really, because you don't see people, you don't feel part of that company, you get a salary and you're doing your job. So there will be interventions. And I've seen it, my daughter's, she moved to London at the beginning of the year, she's doing her articles for her CA, and after 4 or 5 weeks, she was working from home as a first-year article clerk. Now, it's challenging. And it's very interesting. And speaking to other kids here as well, and a lot of, even not such young people, but especially if they started working, it's difficult. But the companies have managed fairly well, I think, generally. But I think it's going to need a whole different mindset of how do you now interact with your staff when they're not there. And you need to spend a lot more time and effort almost having these Zoom meetings that people can actually express feelings and talk. And like we used to have like sort of town hall meetings in the companies and get to people, let them talk to you, let them see the boss, let them ask him questions, let them challenge him.
I think that concludes our discussions. And I think our ability to have these discussions with you, we certainly hope that it will be of benefit to students, those new in the sector, and maybe those who are not so new to the sector. Thank you very much.